And girls. Okay, boys and girls, we are going to be talking about text structure again. Now, remember that authors choose their text structure that best fits their purpose for writing a text. And the text structure that best fits this story or this narrative nonfiction would be, which one of these do you think that best fits what we're reading? Does anybody have an idea? Do you have a guess? Yes. I hope you're going to say sequence. Sequence is the one that best fits what we're reading this week. And in sequence, it helps explain events in order. That's what really happened in the story. This is a true event. It happened in a certain chronological order. And so the author is going to use some certain words. They're going to use those transition words. First, next, finally, last. So we're going to hear those words. Before, maybe, after, words like that. So that's what we're going to kind of be looking at as we're reading our story. So what we're going to do right now is we're going to listen to the whole story without any interruptions. Like yesterday we stopped and we talked about it. We're going to listen to the whole story, and then we're going to go back and we're going to kind of key in on a certain part of the story, and we're going to be looking for some text structure. We're going to be looking for those elements of text structure that then we can talk about. Are you ready for that, boys and girls? Okay? So let's listen to our story. Now, before we even listen to our story, I think it's important that we talk about what type of story this is. And this is a narrative nonfiction. And a narrative nonfiction gives factual information by telling a true story. So this is a true story. The people in this story were real people. The events in this story really happened. So we're hearing a true story. It's in the form of a story, correct?
Yep.
So it's not like it is in a history book type of story, right? But it is in the form of a story, but it is a true story. It is a narrative nonfiction. And so narrative nonfiction includes real people and events and shows those events in chronological order, in the real order that they took place. And it includes words that are specific to the topic. So these are all includes things that are very specific to what was going on in that time. And so we have pictures from that time. Well, we don't have actual pictures, do we? But we have illustrations that are specific to that time period. We looked at some of those pictures, correct? We looked for things that let us know it was from that time period. So let's get ready you're going to be reading along with it, and then we're going to be enjoying our story. And here it is, the flag maker. Pull that up some. And we'll hope today we don't have as many internet problems like we had yesterday when we were listening to our story.
It was 1812, and the United States was at war with Britain. A country at war needed plenty of flags. In Baltimore, a 12-year-old girl named Caroline Pickersgill and her mother, Mary, made flags. Caroline and her mother sewed flags so that militia and cavalry officers could direct their men during battles on land. They sewed flags so that Navy ships could communicate with each other during battles at sea. They sewed flags for the privateers that attacked British ships. But no matter how many flags they made, and no matter how many battles the Americans fought, the Americans could not defeat the British.
Okay, remember you're following along with your book. So be looking in your book at the words.
One summer day, Caroline and her mother welcomed 3 military officers to their flag shop. The men ordered an American flag for Fort McHenry, the fort guarding the waters near Baltimore. The flag must be so large that the British will have no trouble seeing it from a distance, said one officer. Excited, Caroline and her mother set to work right away. Out of wool bunting, they cut pieces for broad red and white stripes. They cut a large field of dark blue. They cut white cotton stars. Broad. Something that is broad is wide. Day after day, they sewed stitch after stitch, red stripe after white stripe, star after star. Caroline's grandmother and cousins helped. So did her mother's slave. Her house servant, too. Night after night, they worked by candlelight, long past bedtime. The wool bunting itched. The needle pricked. Caroline's fingers ached, and her eyes felt gritty and sore. But inch by inch, they sewed until the flag spilled over their laps and lay in folds on the floor. Gritty. When something feels gritty, it feels rough and sandy.
And there it is. The big flag.
Soon the flag outgrew the sewing room. They carried it to a large malt house. They spread out the flag on the malt house floor. And they sewed still more. Finally, after 6 long weeks, the last star was sewn into place. The last threads were snipped and knotted. From hoist to fly, it was the largest flag Caroline had ever seen. The flag was delivered to Fort McHenry, where soldiers raised it high above the ramparts. Each day, Caroline looked for her flag as it waved over the fort. It looked tiny in the distance, but she felt proud. Over the next year, the flag shop grew even busier. Caroline and her mother sewed more flags. The Americans fought more battles. Yet they could not defeat the British once and for all. And so a difficult year passed. Early one August morning, a horse clattered down the Baltimore streets. "British sails!" its rider shouted. "In the Chesapeake Bay!" Caroline knew British ships meant one thing: invasion. All over Baltimore, church bells clanged, calling militiamen to arms. Men and boys shouldered long muskets and lined up on the parade grounds. A snare drum rolled. A bugle flared. A commander shouted, "Forward march!" The militiamen tramped off to rout the British. All that day, Caroline tried to go about her work. She sewed. She swept. She looked for her flag and waited for news. She swept and sewed and waited still more. The next day, Caroline heard a low rumble like a distant thunderstorm. Cannon. She whispered a prayer for the men. Later, terrible news was again shouted in the streets. The Americans had fought a battle and lost. Now British troops were headed to destroy Washington. That night, men, women, and children spilled out onto rooftops. They watched the sky over Washington. It glowed an eerie orange. The British were burning the Capitol. Caroline looked out across the dark harbor toward Fort McHenry. She couldn't see the flag, but she trusted it was there. Baltimore prepared to defend itself. Around the city, men dug trenches and built earthworks. Shovels scraped and clinked. Dirt flew. Women and children carried biscuits and sweet tea to the volunteers. In the channel near Fort McHenry, Men sunk small ships and barges to block the harbor. Women and children tore soft cloths into bandages. Men moved gunboats into position, ready to fire on British ships. Once more, Baltimore waited. A day, a week, 2 weeks. The city held its breath and went to church and went to work and waited for the British to strike. Early one September morning, a loud roar rocked the flag shop. Caroline rushed to the window. British ships were bombing Fort McHenry. Fort McHenry's guns blazed back. Hour after hour, bombs burst louder than thunder. Hour after hour, rockets screamed and flashed brighter than lightning. The shop trembled and shook. The streets turned thick with smoke. The smell of burnt powder filled the air. The British ships crept closer and closer. Evening came. The sky darkened with storm. Rain fell. Soon, thunder and lightning joined the cannon and rockets. Ships and fort and sky boomed and flashed together. Each time the sky lit up, Caroline saw that her flag was still there. At midnight, the bombing stopped. 1 minute, 10 minutes, an hour, and all was still. Caroline longed for morning light. Now she could only sit and hold on to courage. She tried not to sleep, but she did. At dawn, Caroline awoke. The rain had stopped. Everywhere, sky and water and land looked gray. She couldn't see the fort. A breeze passed through the window. Slowly, the sky cleared. There, hoisted high above the ramparts, Caroline saw a tired flag hanging from its staff in the damp morning air. A wool bunting flag sewn full of broad stripes and bright stars, with needles that pricked and fingers that ached. A flag sewn full of pride and courage and hope. Hoisted. If you hoisted a flag, you used ropes to pull it up a pole.
There you go. So now, boys and girls, here's what I want you to do. You have your paper. You have your paper that I gave you. And it's going to ask us some questions about text structure. And it says that text structure is the way information is organized in a text. Authors may use the sequence text structure to tell events in the order that they happened. Authors use transition words to provide clues to the structure. So we all need this paper out. And we're going to need our story open. Okay? It says, answer the questions about pages 200, 250, 258, 259. So turn to that page. So I'm going to go back to that right now. It's a double page. And it is the page where we have the big flag, isn't it? So let's look at that page.
Soon the flag outgrew the sewing room. They carried it to a large malt house. They spread out the flag on the malt house floor. And they sewed still more. Finally, after 6 long weeks, the last star was sewn into place. The last threads were snipped and knotted. From hoist to fly, it was the largest flag Caroline had ever seen.
Okay, so boys and girls, first off, a malt room or a malt house. A malt house is like a big house or a big it's a big building. Yes? Do you know what it is?
Like a big warehouse.
It's kind of like a big warehouse or a big barn.
It's like a house, but it's just got one big room.
It's a big room. kind of like a big barn or a big building, and they kept, do you know what they kept in it, Jensen?
They have what?
They kept grain in it. They kept grain in it, and they would take the grain and they would turn it into something called malt. And they would use malt to make things like beer and whiskey and things like that. So that's what they used in the malt room. That's what was going on with the malt room. So that was a very large room. So they kept the grains in there so they could turn it into the malt. And so it was a big, huge space, and so they were able to keep the flag there because it was so large. Okay, so that's what we have here. So now we have to think about our story and what was going on and the sequence of our story. And so let's look. What I want us to do is, what is the text structure of this part of the selection? We're looking at 258 and 259. What is the text structure here? Logan?
The text structure is they're doing the flag.
Well, that's what's going on in the story, but remember text structure? Here is text structure. Those are text structures. What text structure are they using? Oh, they're making the flag.
Sequence.
They're using sequence, very good. So the text structure is sequence. And how do we know? What's the author doing? Yes?
Because they're using explanations like the last thread was knotted.
Yes, they're using it in order, right? So they're telling us what's going on in order. So the author shows what happens first, next, and finally. So let's say for number 1, we'll say sequence, which is what it is. We'll just say sequence. And then what we're going to say is the author shows what happens first, next, and finally. Okay. Now, boys and girls, how does knowing the text structure help you focus on what is happening? How does that help us? Ivy?
It helps us know what they're doing in order.
It helps us know what they're doing in order because what are they doing? What are they doing?
They're making a flag.
Yeah, it helps us know how to make such a, and not just a flag, it's a, what kind of flag? It's a really what?
Big.
It's a really enormous flag. It's an enormous flag. So yes, thinking about the sequence helps us helps us follow the steps in making such a large flag. Helps us follow the steps in making such an enormous flag. so enormous. I can't imagine it. That building is huge, and that flag is covering the whole floor of that building. Can you imagine? Can you imagine what the size of the stars must have been like?
I wonder how many babies that we would need to build that whole.
I have no idea, but it was so big. So very big, boys and girls. It's so giant. Does everyone have that?
No.
Okay, you just finish it. Very good. So those of our at-home friends, they can pause the video. Those of you who are writing here in class can just continue to write.